Thank you very much. The American popular music business does not like surprises. Well, maybe I should rephrase that. Everybody likes surprises, good surprises. But the fact is that over the course of the 20th century and even until these first couple decades of this century, the American popular music business has tried to control, to a certain extent, of course, to promote, even to a certain extent, really try to keep, I guess, control of the popular music business so they can predict what's going to happen. They're not always very successful at it, I should tell you, because, truth be told, it's very difficult to tell what's going to be popular, especially in popular music, because audiences tend to be quite fickle. But anyway, that's the way they would have it. They like to control the world of popular music as much as they can. So when I talk to you today about two of the biggest acts in the history of 20th century popular music, Elvis Presley and the Beatles, what I want to stress is the fact that they really were, in many ways, surprises to the American music business. They, in a certain sense, came out of nowhere. Let's start with the story of Elvis Presley. And the year is 1956. That really is the big year for the rise of Elvis Presley in this country. If we go back to the end of the Second World War and have a look at the way the American music business was configured at that time, in the period right after 1945 and leading up to the sort of breakout of rock and roll in 1955, the American music business was divided up into what they thought were three categories of music, divided up in very pragmatic kinds of ways in terms of what they thought the markets for popular music were in this country. And so the biggest of those markets is what we'll call the mainstream pop market. That was the singers like that would be people like Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Les Paul, and Mary Ford, singers like that. And the audience for that was thought to be middle-class, urban, and increasingly suburban white people. There were two other markets that were thought of more as niche markets. There was country and western music, which was really thought of as music for Southern whites or recently relocated Southern whites who had come to urban areas but still wanted music from their Southern culture, and African Americans who in many cases also had relocated from rural areas in the South to urban areas in the North. These two smaller markets, country and western and rhythm and blues, the major labels, the big money in music business, wasn't really so concerned with. The real money was in mainstream pop. So it would often happen that a song would be a hit on a rhythm and blues chart, but never appear on the mainstream pop charts. Or if it would be covered by an artist who was already known to people on the popular music charts. So for example, coming from country and western, Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, how's that for a name of a group for you, had a big hit on the country and western charts with New San Antonio Rose. But when it became a hit on the pop charts, it was covered by Bing Crosby. So oftentimes a song could cross over, but not that particular record. What starts to happen in 1955 is the actual records themselves start crossing over, mostly from the R&B charts. So we start to see hits from people in 1955, top pop hits like Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock, Maybelline from Chuck Berry, songs from Fats Domino and Little Richard, and so we begin to see a kind of a crossover. Well, what happens over the course of the 1950s is that crossover increases. By the time we get to 1958 or 1959, over 90% of songs that were hits on the R&B charts were hits on the pop charts. This idea of controlling the business with three categories was beginning to fall apart. And at the center of that falling apart was a young guy from Tupelo, Mississippi, via Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis Presley, who was originally signed to a small independent label in Memphis, Sun Records, recording for Sam Phillips. In 1954, he recorded That's All Right, Mama. Everybody thinks about that as early Elvis, but the important thing about Elvis is when he signed with RCA Records. At the end of 1955, they paid what was thought of as an astronomical fee for Elvis Presley, $35,000 for Elvis Presley to move to RCA Records. In those days, it was like a sports signing or something. Who would spend that much money on a crazy, twitchy country singer? But Elvis Presley was that crazy, twitchy country singer. And when RCA got behind him, and started to put him onto television and started to put his records into wider distribution across the country. We got a whole series of hits: Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel. By the end of the year, it was Love Me Tender. What was interesting about Elvis was that he came in to the pop music world through the country western door. He was signed by RCA in Nashville, not so much out of the New York office, and his first recordings were all done in Nashville. In fact, Chet Atkins was rhythm guitarist and sort of session producer on a lot of those early recordings, along with Steve Scholz. And so one thing that's surprising about Elvis is that he came into pop from country, and that hadn't happened really so much before. The other thing that was surprising about Elvis is that he started to have hits on all three charts at the same time. In a world that had been constructed so that you could predict which records would land in which markets, Elvis Presley was selling in all those markets and all the time. A fantastic thing that absolutely surprised the popular music business, but look, they were happy to make the money, let me tell you that. So Elvis Presley, a big surprise. Now, if we fast forward to the year 1963, 1964, on February the 9th, 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. Everybody knows about this performance, right? It was one of those kinds of key moments in pop culture. George Harrison likes to tell the story that statistics show that for the moments that the Beatles were on TV in New York, crime in New York was actually down. Even the criminals stopped to watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. But the Beatles were actually quite a surprise because they came from someplace that a pop band, especially one that would have sustained success, had never come from before, and that was Great Britain. In the period before 1964, no British star had really had sustained success in this country. Now, British artists had had hits on the charts. Lonnie Donegan in 1956 with Rock Island Line, the famous skiffle tune. Acker Bilk had Stranger on the Shore. The Joe Meek-produced Tornadoes had a hit with Telstar in 1962, a #1 hit, actually. But the biggest name in pop music in the UK in the period before the Beatles was Cliff Richard. And Cliff Richard had a whole series of hits. I mean, dozens of hits in the UK. None of them could ever get any traction in this country. So much so that the Beatles told their manager, Brian Epstein, "We won't play America until we've got a hit, because if Cliff Richard can't get any traction in the US, we will totally fail, and we're not interested in that." So Brian Epstein, their manager, starts to work at getting them these 3 performances on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles had, in the UK, a #17 hit at the end of 1962 with Love Me Do, and then 3 #1 hits in a row. They had Please Please Me, From Me to You, She Loves You, none of which could they get released in this country. The record company in this country was Capitol, and Capitol was actually a subsidiary of EMI, the big company that the Beatles recorded for in the UK. But even Capitol wouldn't release the Beatles records in this country. Why? Because they said, nobody's interested in a British band. I'm telling you, it would not work. So Brian Epstein, at the end of 1963, gets these gigs lined up for the Beatles, 3 nights on the Ed Sullivan Show. Fantastic. The Beatles have told them they're not going over until they have a hit. But Capitol Records is convinced they will release the Beatles' newest single, but they're going to have to put some money behind it. They put all kinds of money behind the promotion of the Beatles. They start this campaign, the Beatles are coming, the Beatles are coming. By the end of December 1963, I Want to Hold Your Hand is released in this country. By the 3rd week of January, it's #1 in the Cashbox charts. By the 1st weeks of February, it's #1 in the Billboard charts. And by February 9th, 1964, the Beatles are on Ed Sullivan. Fantastic. What a wonderful coincidence of events for them. What it did is it provided a tremendous surprise, because all of a sudden the American popular music business was faced with a fad for groups that were British, with matching haircuts and suits and those great British accents, right? The British invasion. And it was a total surprise to them. Of course, the Beatles' sustained success was a surprise to everybody, but even the Beatles themselves. And so in many ways, the Beatles came out of nowhere into this country and surprised the American popular music business. Now, if we were going to continue with this story, Elvis, the Beatles, we might want to think about the rise of Michael Jackson in the 80s, say, for example. Even though Michael Jackson had been a child star in the 70s and had some pretty good success with disco music at the end of the 70s, when he brought out that album, Thriller, it was bigger than any record that anybody had thought could they didn't think that could happen again, this Beatles-Elvis thing. But a lot of it was fueled by his videos on MTV, which really had just launched at the beginning of the 80s and had itself come out of nowhere. So when we think about these things and the ability to control the popular music business, we see that a lot of times some of the best things come as surprises, as much as the music business would not like them to be surprises. And the story of Michael Jackson, well, that's a story for another day. Thank you very much.